Hi, I'm Dan, the EDC academic, and in this video I'm going to be talking about two very similar Victorinox products. This knife, which is the Ranger Grip 79, and this knife, which is the one-handed Trekker. So if that sounds interesting to you, stick around and I'll tell you a little bit about them. Hello, and thank you for sticking with me. As I mentioned in the introduction, these are the two knives I'm going to be talking about today. And apart from doing somewhat of a comparison between them, I'm mostly wanting to give some points of consideration in case you were thinking about getting one of them for yourself. Now, apart from the obvious size difference, these two knives have nearly identical tool sets. This knife here is the Victorinox Ranger Grip 79, differentiated from the Ranger Grip 78 only in terms of whether it has the corkscrew, in which case it's the 79, or the Phillips head, in which case it would be the Ranger Grip 78. But other than that, they are identical. And this knife here is the Victorinox One Hand Trekker, which has the backside Phillips. Now, if this had a backside screwdriver, then this would be called the one-hand Forester. But other than that, the one-hand Trekker and the one-hand Forester have identical tool sets. So if this were a one-hand Forester, it would be identical to the Ranger Grip. In tool set, it would be identical to the Ranger Grip 79. Or if this were Ranger Grip 78, it would have an identical tool set to the one-hand Trekker. So with those differences out of the way, let's talk about the specific knives. Now, this knife here, the Ranger Grip 79, I have done a modification on it. So if you purchase one, if you're looking at them online, you will not see this hex head hole here. That is a modification that I did so that I could use the ratchet here from my Leatherman. Now, I only use this for light duty applications. I wouldn't be drilling, 1.5 inch holes with this, but for light duty applications, this does wonderful. And I will mention, if you decide to do this modification and to use the Leatherman ratchet system, I would only line up the ratchet system when it's in line with the corkscrew. If you attempt to put it in the other direction, it will miss the back spring and it will bump into the teeth, of the saw blade. So I'm not really going to be talking about that modification though, because I just want to talk about the knives. And the knives themselves are not only different in size, but they're a little bit different in the presentation. You'll notice that we have serrations on the one-hand Trekker, and we don't have any serrations on the Ranger Grip. Now, if you object to the serrations, you could get the Forester. The Forester does not have serrations on it. And I think the Trailmaster, I think that's another variation that does not have the serrations on it. But the one-hand Trekker is basically the civilian version of the Swiss soldier's knife, which is identical to this with the exception of the scales. The Swiss soldier's knife has green scales, and it does not have the little Victorinox shield there, and it does not have the scale tools. But beyond that, the Swiss soldier's knife and the one-hand Trekker are identical. And both the Ranger Grip and the one-hand Trekker have liner locks. In the case of the Ranger Grip 79, it is a button-actuated liner lock. And so you press on the shield there, and it pushes the liner out of the way, and then you can fold the knife and close it. The one-hand Trekker also has a liner lock, but it's a more traditional liner lock, meaning that it doesn't have the button actuator, but you access it from the opposite side. But beyond that, it's just your standard liner locking mechanism. And I will mention at this point that the Victorinox Ranger Grip is part of the Delamont series, which essentially means that it's based on a Wenger design, and it has incorporated some Victorinox tools in it, most notably the Victorinox style can opener there. But this is a Wenger design. You can see that in the design of the cap lifter, which is on the opposite side on the one-hand trekker. You will see the difference in design there. The Victorinox cap lifter also has a liner lock on it. I'll talk about that in a minute. And it has the half stop, whereas the Delamont, which is basically a Wenger, does not have the half stop. And it doesn't lock in a traditional sense. It will lock whenever you're using it, though. And this is the standard Wenger design whenever you press on it. I don't know how well this is going to be appearing on screen. Let me try to move it a little bit closer to the camera. Whenever you apply force to it, it pushes ever so slightly between the liners, and that's what prevents it from closing on you. So it does have a locking mechanism, but only when in use, whenever you're applying force to the tip specifically. But going back to the difference in design element between the bottle openers with the cap lifters here, you see that they both have the wire bender / wire stripper. They're both cap lifters. They both work equally effectively. There is a difference at the tip. You'll see that the tip of the Victorinox One Hand Trekker is wider than the tip of the Delamont of the Ranger Grip 79. And you will also notice that the Victorinox One Hand Trekker is a little bit wider, similar thickness, but the one on the Victorinox seems, on the One Hand Trekker, seems to be geared more into the pry bar application than the screwdriver application. Because of the wider tip, it's going to be somewhat more limiting in terms of the screws that you might have access to. But it's got that big, nice, wide plane there if you wanted to use it as a pry bar. And just on the basis of aesthetics alone, I much prefer the cap lifter on the One Hand Trekker. The large bottle opener on the Ranger Grip 79 has just always struck me as just slightly odd looking and out of proportion with these sort of, weird angles and shapes to it. I much prefer, again, based on aesthetics alone, I much prefer the shape of the cap lifter. Regarding the locking mechanism, I'm not the biggest fan of the placement of the locking mechanism. And the reason for that is because even though it's in theory it's a simple liner lock, you kind of have trouble accessing it with your thumb without also pressing on the blade itself, which long term could result in repeatedly pushing the blade, putting pressure on it whenever you're trying to activate the liner lock there, could potentially end up pushing this blade slightly off center. So you kind of have to get your thumb, manipulate your thumb in there just to get the nail on it without putting pressure on the blade to push that liner lock out of the way and getting it to where you can unlock it. It's not a big deal, but it is a minor inconvenience that I notice every time I go to utilize that liner lock. Again, this one just goes freely because it only locks whenever you're applying pressure on it. The other tool is identical because this is the Delamont series. It is that hybrid between the old Wenger products and Victorinox products. So they both both of these knives utilize your standard Victorinox can opener. No lock there. The scale tools are identical. And even though these are both 3-layer knives, and you can see right there, the layers themselves are of an identical width, the scales are of different width. And so what that means is that the Victorinox Ranger Grip is slightly thicker overall than the Victorinox One Hand Trekker because of the scales. The Ranger Grip obviously has that contoured grip function on it, and that necessarily adds some additional girth to the knife. And so even though they're identical in terms of the layers, they feel very different in the hand. And I mentioned the size difference earlier. The closed length of the Victorinox Ranger Grip 79. And I'm not going to include that little bit extending out for the keychain there. I'm just going to be looking at the knife itself is right at 5 inches long. The overall length of the One Hand Trekker is about 4 1/4 inches long. So that translates to an overall length difference. The Victorinox Ranger Grip 79 is just at 8 3/4 inches long. The overall length of the One Hand Trekker is just at 7 3/4 of an inch long. So overall, the Ranger Grip 79 is a full inch longer than the One Hand Trekker. But interestingly, the blade length is only off by about 1/4 of an inch. You can see the length of the blade there, the cutting edge rather of the blade, is right at 3 inches, just over 3 inches, about 3 1/8 on the One Hand Trekker. The cutting edge of the Victorinox, and I'll talk more about that in a minute, it begins right there. And we see that that is just shy, about 3 3/8 of an inch long, in comparison to the cutting edge on the Wenger of about 3 1/8 of an inch long. So there's only 1/4 of an inch difference, despite a 1 inch, despite the One Hand Trekker being 1 inch shorter overall. The cutting edge is only 1/4 of an inch difference. And so effective cutting isn't going to be all that different between these two knives, despite the huge difference in the overall length. I'm going to close these back up here just for safety purposes. Okay, I'm interrupting this video because I noticed in post-production that I had forgotten to go back and mention a couple of things. The first thing that I noticed I forgot to mention was the edge on the Victorinox Ranger 78. I had mentioned earlier about how the edge doesn't actually start until right about there on this particular model. And I'm mentioning that because somewhat humorously, I had seen some other some guys on YouTube that sort of complained about that and felt that Victorinox had attempted to cheat them out of some blade because there was some edge, because there was so much blade left over there. And I had seen some, what I would describe as low IQ YouTubers attempt to modify it by extending the bevel on that edge for farther down the blade, only to realize after they had done that modification the reason why Victorinox didn't go down any farther. And the reason why is because there's a pin inside of there that acts as the blade stop. So Victorinox left that unbeveled, unsharpened on purpose, so that whenever you fold the knife, that flat portion of the edge there in the area that we refer to as the ricasso, that's what is actually hitting the pin that's stopping the blade from going forward. And people were modifying this knife before they understood the construction of the knife, only to realize afterward that they had made a grievous error in that modification. So that's the reason why you have so much less edge there than you do blade. And the other thing that I realized that I forgot to mention was one other small difference between the Ranger 79 and the One Hand Trekker is in the design of the awl/reamer. You'll notice that the Victorinox 79, the Ranger Grip, the Grip 79 has the sewing eye in the reamer, whereas in the awl, whereas on the One Hand Trekker, which is just the civilian version of the Swiss Soldier, does not have the sewing eye. So those were two of the things that I forgot to mention while I was recording the main video. And I just wanted to interrupt the regular viewing of this so I could make sure that I included everything that I wanted to talk about. So now I'm going to return you to the main part of the video. So I've talked about the overall length, I've talked about the blade. Once again, I will mention that if you don't like the serrations on this one, you do have the non-serrated version available to you if you just get the Forester. But I'm not going to get into the whole serrated versus non-serrated debate in this video. I happen to like the serrations on this particular model, which is why I chose it over the Forester. But let me talk about really quickly the corkscrew on the back of the Ranger Grip 79. Now, of course, if you went with the Forester instead of the One Hand Trekker here, you would have a corkscrew on the back of it. But it would not be the corkscrew on the, yeah, this is what I wanted. I lost track of what I was doing there for a second. The corkscrew on the Ranger Grip 79 is not compatible with the little tools that fit in your standard Victorinox corkscrew. And the reason why, as you can see, the corkscrew on the back side of the Ranger Grip 79 is a 5-turn instead of a 4-turn corkscrew, and it is ever so slightly wider in diameter. It's a little bit easier to see that if you put one inside of the other. So you can see there, not only are they different in length, the radius, excuse me, the diameter of the 4-turn in the 91 millimeter is slightly smaller. And as a result, whenever you go to attempt to stick a little tool in it, it just threads all the way through. It will not stay in there. And so if one of the reasons why you're thinking about getting something in the 130 millimeter series that has a corkscrew on the back side is so that you can use the little micro tools, that will not work. That will not be effective. Okay, here, so what else do I want to talk about? I've talked about the blade, I talked about the locking mechanism. Another quirk of the locking mechanism, I take that back, another quirk of the access to the blade. Even though both of these are one-handed operation, that's only sort of limited true in the case of the Ranger Grip. It is, in fact, one-hand operable, but that is limited to the right hand, and that is due for 2 considerations. One, they put the blade all the way over on the side that has the Victorinox shield on it. So whenever you're holding it in your right hand, the blade is very close to your thumb, and then you can open it that way. And then, again, you close it by pressing the shield. But if you're left-handed, or if you're injured and aren't able to use your right hand, this is not one-hand openable. The screwdriver there, the cap lifter, it pushes up so much, and the blade itself is on the opposite side of a somewhat thick knife that you can't get your thumb in there to open it. I'm really, of course, this is my non-dominant hand, and so my dexterity isn't quite as good as it is in my right hand. But that's not really the issue. The issue is the access, which is blocked by this cap lifter here. You really have to struggle to get your thumb in there, and you can see it just doesn't work left-handed. Right-handed, it is very easily one-hand openable. That is not an issue for the one-hand trekker. You'll see that the blade is at the very center of the knife there, and there aren't any encumbrances that are denying you access, and so you can open it with your right hand, but it is just as easily openable using the left hand. So that, to my mind, is a clear advantage for the one-hand trekker, especially if you're left-handed. But also, people have this tendency to, whenever they're picturing themselves in an outdoor environment, they're picturing themselves under an optimal set of circumstances without injury in fair weather. But if you're cold, if you have an injured hand and you need to open an implement, it makes it more of a consideration. And this is far better under conditions of duress. If you have an injury to one hand, you're always going to be able to open the one-hand trekker. with one hand, either one. It is truly ambidextrous in that manner, whereas you are quite limited whenever you are dealing with the Ranger Grip 79. And one final point of consideration I will mention about these tools here is the saw. Now, because of the size difference, obviously you're going to have a much larger saw with the Ranger Grip 79, and I'll go ahead and get a measurement here. The saw, the cutting portion of the saw on the one-hand trekker is right at 3.5 inches. The cutting portion of the saw on the Ranger Grip 79 is right at 4 inches. So you have an additional 1/2 inch length there, which, you know, normally would make you think, well, this is going to be a better, more effective saw. And that's true to an extent, but as I'm lining up the knives here, I'm sure you've already noticed what I'm getting ready to point out. Look at the Victorinox One Hand Trekker. Look how it is canted. It is canted toward the rear of the knife. On the Ranger Grip 79, it is canted toward the front of the knife. Now, if you're always cutting and you're holding, you know, if your stock is here and you're coming right down on it, of course you'd be doing it this way, there wouldn't necessarily be an issue with that. But that's not how most people cut. Most people, when they cut, are holding the knife down at a downward angle and coming down on the stock that way. And whenever you have the knife, the saw, which is canted forward, if you should happen to catch it, or if the blade, the saw blade would bind within the stock, you run the risk of it folding forward on you and causing an injury, because you'd be holding it like that with your fingers in the path. If it gets, if it binds up, if it gets caught up on something, you run the risk of it closing on you, and it just makes it so much easier for that to happen. Whereas on the Victorinox, the one-hand trekker, again, it's canted slightly back. And so it's much more safe if you're cutting in the downward tradition, but it's also going to be safer the way you would be using the saw under the majority sets of circumstances, holding it at an angle like this and coming down on it, because it is canted slightly upward in that case, toward the back of the hand there. It makes it safer and less likely for it to, in the event that it binds, it would make it less likely for it to be pushed forward, because it would simply have more distance to travel, and you'd be operating it at an angle that would make it less likely for that to happen in the first place. So I think with all those things being said, I'm ready to wrap up this review. The one-hand trekker, I think, makes a better knife to have in your pocket and to have on you. Whenever I go out, the Ranger Grip 79, this is the knife that I just leave on the picnic table. Whenever we're doing car camping, this will come out of my bag. It will go on the table just as a community knife, because it's always surprising to me as to how, as to the number of people that will join you on a camping trip that do not themselves have a knife. And so this is just something that I leave out on the table for obvious reasons, obvious applications. It has the knife, it has the corkscrew, which does come in handy for people that are joining and bringing bottles of wine without openers. It contains the can opener, the lifter, the saw for fireside applications. So this is a very handy knife to have out. It's sturdier, it's larger, and it's just a nice knife to have set aside on the table. A little bit bulky to actually carry on your person, and for that reason I like the one-hand trekker. It's a little bit slimmer, same tool set. You can use it with, it is truly ambidextrous. You can use it with either hand. And I think for those, and it's safer with the saw. And I think for those considerations, I have to give the nod to the trekker. But I obviously like the Ranger Grip also. It's part of my collection, and it's something that goes with me on every camping trip. But with those things being said, I think I've touched upon everything that I wanted to talk about for the purpose of this video. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you next time.